good evening, and welcome back. Tonight, let's rest our minds with a quiet story, one that drifts like smoke over a dying campfire. As you listen, you might feel the warmth of that fire, the rhythm of your breathing slowing down, and the world outside fading into silence. This is not a story of loud battles or shouting generals. It's about the silence that came after, a silence heavy enough to almost end the world. Before we start, may I ask, where are you listening from tonight? Is it quiet there? What time is it on your side of the world? Before we wander too far, if you enjoy calm stories like this, you can gently press the like or subscribe button. No rush. You can do it later, after you fall asleep. When World War II ended, many thought the world would finally rest. Cities were rebuilding, families were returning home, and tired soldiers dreamed of peace. But beneath the surface, another kind of tension was growing, a quiet, invisible one. It spread through the air like cold wind, unseen but deeply felt. Two nations, once allies, began to look at each other not with trust, but with suspicion. The United States stood on one side, powerful and proud of its new strength. The Soviet Union stood on the other, wounded yet unyielding, determined not to bow to anyone again. Both had fought the same enemy, but now they began to fear each other more than anything else. The war had ended, but the peace that followed was fragile, thin, and trembling. People around the world sensed it, even if they didn't fully understand it. It was in the newspapers, in whispered conversations, and in the way leaders spoke on radio broadcasts. Every promise of peace carried a hint of threat. Every handshake seemed to hide a clenched fist. The world, for the first time, was divided not by borders, but by fear. If you're still awake, let your thoughts drift for a moment. Imagine the world in 1947. The streets filled with children again, laughter echoing where bombs once fell. But high above, in hidden offices, men studied maps, drew lines, and prepared for something unspoken. They called it strategy. The rest of the world just called it anxiety. The tension wasn't loud. It hummed quietly, like the low sound of electricity before a storm. Governments built new weapons not to use them, but to show that they could. It was a strange kind of peace, one where silence was more dangerous than sound. And yet, most people simply wanted to move on, to live, to sleep without fear. Now and then, remember to breathe slowly. In and out. The past can't harm you now. It's only a story. But the people of that time didn't know how close they stood to disaster. Their nights were filled with radio static and speeches that never seemed to end. And in the space between words, the Cold War quietly began. The phrase itself was odd, a war that wasn't really a war. No soldiers meeting face to face. No official battles declared. Just spies, plans, and endless competition. A global stare-down that stretched for decades. Each side watching, waiting, and wondering who would blink first. Sometimes, when the night was calm, people forgot it existed. They'd walk their dogs, tuck in their children, and whisper prayers of gratitude. But then a siren would sound, or a headline would appear, reminding them that the world's peace rested on fragile ground. And just like that, the calm would vanish again, replaced by quiet dread. If you're still with me, let your eyes grow heavy. This part of history moves slowly, like the rhythm of waves or the crackle of an old radio. We are only at the beginning of a long, uneasy peace. Soon, we'll see how fear became a language of its own, one that almost ended civilization. As the months turned into years, that invisible tension only grew heavier. Each country tested new machines, launched new ideas, and spoke carefully, always careful, as if one wrong word could start something no one could stop. People called it diplomacy, but it often felt like standing on ice that might crack at any moment. The calm faces of leaders hid sleepless nights, and every handshake on camera was followed by long meetings behind closed doors. Far away from those meetings, ordinary people tried to live quiet lives. They planted gardens, repaired houses, and told stories by candlelight. Yet even they could feel that strange energy in the air, a global unease that traveled through radio waves and headlines. The Cold War didn't shout, It whispered, and its whisper reached every home. Some found comfort in pretending it wasn't real. They laughed, worked, and watched their children grow, as if the world's balance didn't depend on human restraint. Others couldn't escape the thought that everything could vanish in a single moment of misjudgment. It was a different kind of fear. Not a scream, but a quiet ache that lived beneath the skin. If your thoughts begin to wander, let them. The past is safe here. It can't hurt you. What happened then is simply a memory of what fear can build when it's left unchecked. And like all memories, it fades, softly, slowly, until only lessons remain. In secret, both sides began to build alliances. Countries gathered behind them like pieces on a chessboard, unsure whether they were being protected or used. Maps were redrawn not with ink, but with ideology, invisible lines dividing friends and strangers. It was no longer about land or resources. It was about influence and who would shape the world that came next. The quiet was deceptive. Every headline seemed normal, yet every word carried a hidden message. The speeches, the agreements, even the smiles at international meetings, all of them led with meaning. It was a time when truth and performance were the same thing. Everyone acted calm, even when their hearts were pounding. From time to time, a small event would break through the stillness. A spy caught, a country switching sides, a new weapon revealed. And each time, the world held its breath. Would this be it? Would the silence finally explode? But then, nothing. The tension would rise and fall again, like the slow rhythm of uneasy breathing. If you're still awake, let that rhythm guide you now. Slow, gentle, safe. The people of that era never knew when the calm might end, but tonight, you do. You know this story ends in survival, not destruction. So you can rest while they worry. You can listen while they hold their breath. As the decade ended, the Cold War was no longer new. It had become a part of daily life, like weather or the sound of distant thunder. People stopped waiting for it to end. They simply learned to live beside it. The fear was still there, but softer now, more familiar, almost background noise. And that quiet dread would linger for generations. The world after the war didn't collapse in fire. It froze in tension. Nations watched one another through satellites and spies, through news and silence. The war was over, but peace had never truly arrived. And as night deepens around you, remember, history often moves quietly, just like this. Not with explosions, but with whispers that change everything. Good night, and let the world of 1947 fade gently from your thoughts. The campfire burns low, the air is still, and the story will wait for you whenever you return. Sleep peacefully, for the Cold War has only just begun. The quiet tension of the post-war years slowly hardened into something more deliberate, a race not of runners or horses, but of nations. Each side looked at the other and saw not a neighbor, but a rival. The world had survived one great war, and yet, both powers began to prepare for another that they swore they didn't want. It began with fear, fear of being weaker, slower, or unprepared. Factories that once built tanks now built rockets. Scientists who dreamed of exploring space were suddenly asked to design weapons that could reach across oceans. And though no shots were fired, the race itself was exhausting, endless, and dangerously quiet. The United States poured its effort into innovation. Faster jets, stronger missiles, brighter screens of data. Across the ocean, the Soviet Union did the same, refusing to fall behind. Both built not just machines, but messages, showing the world who held the future in their hands. It was less about attack and more about proving a point. We can, if we must. In secret laboratories and cold offices, scientists worked under the pressure of history itself. Every discovery felt like a victory, every failure a national shame. Some dreamed that their work might bring peace through strength. Others knew that strength alone could never bring peace, only more competition, more fear, more sleepless nights. As the world watched, the skies began to fill with ambition. Satellites, rockets, and long-range missiles marked the new frontier. What had once been about protecting borders became a race to control the heavens. And somewhere between the stars and the ground, humanity's pride started to outweigh its caution. If you listen closely to this part of history, you might notice the rhythm of obsession. The ticking of clocks in laboratories, the hum of machines, the shuffle of papers marked classified. Each sound carried the same question: who will win first? And beneath that question, the quieter one: what happens if we both lose? In classrooms and newspapers, children learned new words: nuclear, arms race, deterrence. They drew pictures of rockets instead of rainbows, because the sky had changed meaning. The horizon was no longer just beautiful, it was dangerous. And yet, life went on, as it always does, people working, eating, dreaming, under a sky that could end them. From time to time, both sides tested their strength, not with battle, but with numbers. Missiles were paraded through city streets. Explosions were shown in films, not to terrify the enemy, but to reassure one's own people. It was an age of appearances, where showing power was as important as having it. Through it all, there was a strange kind of calm. No one wanted war, yet everyone prepared for it. It was like standing in a room filled with fuel, and trusting that no one would ever strike a match. The world had learned how to survive destruction by balancing on the edge of it. And as the race continued, the meaning of victory began to blur. Each new weapon made the world less safe, not more. Each step forward in technology pushed humanity a little closer to the line it dared not cross. The Cold War was no longer just about politics or pride. It had become a test of patience, restraint, and the fragile wisdom that sometimes not acting is the bravest act of all. As the years went on, the race grew colder, more methodical, and strangely predictable. Every time one side achieved something new, a faster rocket, a stronger bomb, a louder declaration, the other replied in kind. It became a rhythm, a back-and-forth pulse that defined the age. And in that rhythm, the rest of the world learned to live with anxiety as if it were weather, always present, always shifting, yet never truly gone. Beneath the surface of progress, there was exhaustion. Economies strained, scientists aged early, and leaders wore the weight of unseen choices. Each side believed they were protecting peace, but both were building a world where peace had to be proven through power. It was a strange paradox, to maintain safety by preparing for destruction, to guard life with the threat of ending it. If you picture those years in your mind, imagine vast fields of concrete launch sites hidden beneath the clouds. Metal towers rising like monuments to fear, their shadows long and silent. Somewhere in those places, men sat in bunkers, watching blinking lights that could change the world with one command. And yet, in nearby towns, children played outside, unaware of how fragile their peace truly was. Technology became the new weapon, and science its soldier. Computers calculated trajectories faster than any human hand. Machines replaced instincts, and decisions were timed to fractions of seconds. The world had grown so advanced, it could end itself more efficiently than ever before. And still, people believed that control meant safety, that as long as someone was watching, disaster could be avoided. Every new invention carried two faces. One promised exploration, satellites to study the Earth, rockets to reach the stars. The other promised destruction, silent and final. In the Cold War, even wonder became a weapon. The same technology that could bring humanity together also reminded it how easily everything could fall apart. There were moments when the tension eased, brief pauses in the storm. Talks of disarmament, promises to reduce weapons, meetings held with careful smiles. But even then, both sides kept building, just in case. Because trust, once broken by fear, is hard to rebuild. And the world, still haunted by the memory of past wars, wasn't ready to risk believing again. If your mind begins to drift, let it. The hum of this history is soft, like the sound of old film rolling in a quiet room. The people living then could not rest the way you can now. They carried the weight of the unknown, wondering if tomorrow would come. You, though, can listen from a safe distance and let their tension fade into memory. By the late 1950s, the competition reached the stars. The first satellites blinked in orbit, and for the first time, humanity looked up and saw its own creation circling the Earth. It should have been a moment of unity. Instead, it became another contest, whose technology would reach farther, whose flag would stand higher, whose message would echo louder across the sky. The night sky, once a symbol of calm, became a silent scoreboard. Each new success carried pride and panic in equal measure. Every nation that looked up saw both possibility and threat, both beauty and danger. The stars themselves became witnesses to human ambition, shining above a world that feared its own progress. And as this part of history closes, imagine the quiet between rocket launches, between tests and speeches. That's where the real story lived, in the space between pride and fear, between survival and surrender. The race for power was never truly about winning. It was about learning how close humanity could stand to the edge without falling. And somehow, through restraint and exhaustion, the world managed not to cross it. Yet. The Cold War was not fought on open battlefields. It was fought in silence, in the space between conversations, in coded notes, and in the quiet footsteps of strangers who knew too much. While the world above looked calm, beneath it lay a labyrinth of secrets. Governments built invisible armies, not of soldiers, but of listeners, watchers, and whisperers. Spies became the shadows of the modern age. They were everywhere and nowhere at once. Ordinary faces on trains, voices on intercepted calls, names that didn't belong to the lives they lived. Some carried cameras no bigger than coins. Others passed information hidden inside letters, buttons, or even music records. It was a world where truth and lies shared the same breath. Each nation believed its survival depended on what it knew, or what it could pretend to know. Secrets became more valuable than gold, and trust was traded like currency. A misplaced word could end a career. A wrong address could change the course of policy. Even allies spied on one another, because in the Cold War, friendship always came with suspicion. For the people inside that world, silence became a second language. They learned to think twice before speaking, to smile carefully, and to never write down more than necessary. Entire lives were built on pretending. To be a spy was to live on the edge of two realities, one visible, one hidden, and to never forget which mask you were wearing. Cities like Berlin, Moscow, and Washington became the silent capitals of this invisible war. In coffee shops, in dim hotel rooms, in crowded train stations, information changed hands like contraband. Each transaction felt like a heartbeat in a world that couldn't afford to stop. And though the players were few, their influence reached millions who would never know their names. If you close your eyes, imagine the rhythm of that time, the shuffle of paper, the creak of old telephones, the faint hiss of radio static. These sounds carried the weight of danger. A message received could mean safety, or it could mean exposure. Every night, somewhere in the world, someone stayed awake, waiting for a signal that might never come. The life of a spy was often lonely. They lived far from home, surrounded by people they could never truly know. Their friendships were rehearsed, their smiles strategic. Some dreamed of returning to a normal life, but normalcy had become something foreign. In the end, many of them were ghosts long before they disappeared. As governments competed for influence, the networks grew wider and more complex. Some spies were trained from youth. Others were ordinary people persuaded by ideology, fear, or quiet desperation. There were those who betrayed their own countries for money, and those who betrayed for what they believed was peace. In truth, most lived in the grey, where right and wrong blurred into survival. The secrets they carried were not just about missiles or politics. They were about people, scientists, defectors, families caught between two worlds. Every hidden message had a face behind it, someone risking everything for a truth they could never speak aloud. And every truth revealed was followed by silence, as if the world needed a moment to breathe before reacting. If you listen closely, you can almost hear that silence, the hum of the Cold War's hidden heartbeat. Beneath the grand speeches and parades, beneath the headlines and broadcasts, there was this quieter war. A war fought not with bombs or tanks, but with whispers, patience, and fear. And in that silence, history took shape, written by those who could never sign their names. The longer the Cold War continued, the more tangled the web became. Every secret led to another. Every revelation uncovered two more lies. Intelligence agencies grew into vast, unseen empires of paperwork, signals, and coded reports. Somewhere in that maze, truth became difficult to recognize. Sometimes, even those gathering information no longer knew what was real and what was rumor. For the agents who lived double lives, the price was often heavy. Some vanished without explanation, leaving only quiet apartments and unclaimed belongings. Others were captured, their names whispered briefly in headlines before fading into silence. The rest simply aged in the shadows, carrying the burden of everything they couldn't tell the world. Secrets don't stay light for long. They grow heavier with each passing year. Ordinary citizens were not untouched by this hidden war. Rumors of spies filled newspapers and late-night radio shows. Neighbors began to look at each other differently, wondering who might be listening. A simple friendship could become dangerous, and curiosity was no longer harmless. The fear of infiltration turned entire cities into stages of quiet performance. Everyone acted calm, but everyone suspected someone. Technology, once a symbol of progress, became a silent accomplice. Wires under desks, microphones and lamps, messages transmitted through satellite signals. The Cold War created a world where privacy was not just rare, it was impossible. Even within families, there were unspoken rules. Don't ask too many questions, don't mention certain names, and always keep the radio low. At the heart of all this was one idea: control. Information was power, and whoever could see or hear the most believed they could shape the world. But with each secret gathered, the fear grew stronger. Because if one side could see everything, then the other side could too. The more knowledge they collected, the less anyone felt safe. If your mind begins to wander, that's all right. This part of history moves slowly, like the turning of old film reels. It's the quiet kind of story, where danger lives between moments of stillness. The spies of the Cold War didn't fight to win. Most of them fought simply to endure another day without being discovered. Their victories were measured in silence, not celebration. There were rare moments of humanity amid the deception. A shared glance between enemies who understood each other too well. An intercepted message deliberately left unread. Even in a world of secrets, compassion sometimes slipped through the cracks. But such moments were fleeting, like sparks in the dark, gone before anyone could truly see them. Some of the greatest stories from that era will never be told. Files remain locked, names erased, and memories deliberately forgotten. The Cold War's secret world still lingers in the shadows of modern intelligence, a quiet reminder of how fragile trust can be. The true measure of that time is not what was revealed, but what stayed hidden. By the time the world began to thaw, many of those who had lived in secrecy could no longer return to ordinary life. Their habits were too deep, their sense of danger too ingrained. Even as nations started to talk openly, these people remained silent. They had spent years speaking through codes and glances, and real words now felt foreign. And so, as the age of spies began to fade, the world carried forward their quiet legacy, a mixture of caution, curiosity, and control. The Cold War had created not only weapons and walls, but an entire culture of watching. And though the spies disappeared into history, the habit of surveillance never truly left. The whispering world they built still echoes softly beneath our modern lives, reminding us that even peace has its secrets. In the heart of Europe, there once stood a city divided not just by politics, but by fear. Berlin, a name that came to symbolize the world's great divide. After the war, it was meant to be a place of rebuilding, a symbol of cooperation between nations. But instead, it became the front line of an invisible conflict. Every street carried tension, every border crossing held its breath. The Cold War, once quiet and distant, now had walls you could touch. The Berlin Wall did not rise overnight. It began with small steps, checkpoints, fences, guarded crossings. Families woke up one morning to find their neighborhood split in two. Friends could wave across the border, but never embrace again. What had once been a city of shared laughter and markets became a map of limits, marked by concrete, barbed wire, and watchtowers. For the people who lived there, the wall was more than a structure. It was a daily reminder of distance. On one side, Western life moved quickly, bright lights, commerce, open speech. On the other, Eastern discipline held firm, controlled, measured, watchful. Yet both sides carried the same quiet longing: to walk freely, to see familiar faces, to cross without fear. Every day, families gathered near the wall, trying to catch glimpses of loved ones. Some brought binoculars, others whispered names through cracks in the concrete. A few risked everything to cross, through tunnels, under fences, even by air. Many failed. The wall didn't just divide land, it divided hope. The city's rhythm changed from heartbeat to echo. If you close your eyes, you can imagine it: the grey slabs cutting through streets, the cold wind brushing against stone. Soldiers paced above, their boots steady, their faces unreadable. Below, the city hummed with quiet defiance. People still fell in love, still painted, still wrote songs. Life continued, even in halves. Children born after the wall appeared grew up knowing nothing else. For them, separation was normal. East and West were just facts, like the seasons. Yet even they could sense something missing, a kind of silence adults didn't talk about. The wall shaped their childhood, their dreams, and the way they imagined freedom. Over time, art began to appear on the Western side: bright colors, strange symbols, words painted in defiance. The wall became a canvas for expression, even rebellion. While one side guarded it with soldiers, the other covered it with paint, as if color itself could challenge authority. In its own way, art became the quiet protest that guns could not silence. On the eastern side, the view was different: plain, grey, and watched. Cameras scanned the horizon, dogs patrolled the fields, and every sound felt amplified in the cold air. People walked carefully, their thoughts guarded. Yet in their hearts, a small fire of patience burned. They believed that walls, no matter how high, could never last forever. If you're still awake, let your breathing slow with the rhythm of this divided city. Each inhale brings the sound of footsteps on stone. Each exhale, the faint hum of life continuing beyond barriers. The Berlin Wall was more than a border. It was a monument to endurance. It showed how quietly people could resist, simply by continuing to live. And so, year after year, the wall stood firm. Tourists came to stare, governments used it as a symbol, and the world accepted its existence as inevitable. But beneath that acceptance, something was shifting: a quiet restlessness, a collective heartbeat growing stronger with time. Walls can divide cities, but they can never contain dreams. As the years passed, the wall began to feel permanent, like a scar that would never heal. Children became adults without ever seeing the other side, and the idea of unity faded into memory. Still, small acts of hope continued. Letters smuggled through guards, radio signals whispered across frequencies, music drifting through the air. Every forbidden connection became an act of quiet rebellion. The wall could stop footsteps, but it could not silence longing. Governments spoke of peace while reinforcing barriers. New watchtowers rose even as talks of diplomacy filled the air. The people listened but no longer believed. They had seen too many promises vanish behind official smiles. And yet, they waited, not with anger, but with a deep, patient weariness. Hope, after all, is a stubborn thing. It lingers even when it no longer makes sense. Beyond the wall, the rest of the world moved on. New inventions, new wars, new headlines. But for Berlin, time seemed to slow. Each season passed like a sigh. Snow gathered on the wall in winter, melting into grey puddles in spring. It became part of the city's landscape, something both ordinary and unbearable, a reminder that division can feel normal when it lasts long enough. If you imagine standing near that wall, you might feel the stillness first, the faint hum of electric wires, the murmur of distant traffic, and then, beneath it all, the quiet sound of resilience, people carrying groceries, children playing in courtyards, neighbors sharing what little they had. Life continued because it had to, even when the horizon was blocked by concrete. Art and music began to speak more boldly as the years went on. Poets wrote about imaginary bridges. Singers hummed songs of reunion. Painters covered grey walls with colour and message. Their art did not break the wall, but it weakened the silence that held it in place. Every word, every brushstroke, became part of a quiet revolution that started not with force, but with feeling. In the 1980s, something began to shift. The world beyond Berlin was changing. Economies failing, governments softening, voices growing louder. People were tired of pretending that fear was normal. The whispers that had once been secret became conversations. The air grew heavy with anticipation, the kind that comes before a storm that brings relief instead of ruin. If your mind starts to drift, let it float with the pace of this moment in history. Imagine the city at dusk, lights flickering, guards pacing, families sitting by radios. Each person sensed something was coming, though none could name it. The wall, once so solid, began to feel fragile. Change often begins quietly, like cracks spreading through stone. Crowds began to gather, not with weapons, but with voices. They carried candles, not torches. Their chants were soft but steady, echoing through streets that had known silence for too long. The guards, once firm, began to hesitate. Orders no longer carried the same weight. Fear, for the first time, began to slip through their fingers. Then, one night in 1989, the impossible happened. The checkpoints opened. People crossed freely, some in disbelief, some in tears. The sound that filled the air wasn't the roar of victory, but laughter, the kind that breaks after years of restraint. Families reunited, strangers embraced, and pieces of the wall crumbled under hands that had waited too long to touch freedom. The fall of the Berlin Wall wasn't a single event. It was the ending of a long-held breath. Concrete turned to dust, and hope returned to the streets. But its lesson remained, that walls, no matter how strong, cannot outlast the human spirit. They stand only as long as fear holds power. And when people remember how to dream together, even the coldest divisions begin to fade like morning mist. When fear began to reach the surface of daily life, people started to look down, beneath their feet, beneath their homes, searching for safety in the earth itself. The Cold War had given the world a new kind of terror, one that fell from the sky. It wasn't the sound of armies marching, but the silence of waiting for something that might never come. And so, nations dug. They built deep tunnels and hidden shelters, believing that survival could be buried away. Concrete became comfort, and the hum of machinery replaced the sound of open air. Families across cities began to build their own versions of safety. Basements turned into bunkers. Schools ran drills where children hid under wooden desks, their small hands covering their heads as if it could guard them from fire. Governments distributed manuals on how to survive the unthinkable, how to stock food, seal windows, and wait for light to return. It was a strange ritual of hope in the shadow of destruction, a quiet prayer for control in a world that felt unpredictable. If you stood in those years and listened carefully, you would hear two different worlds, one above, full of television news, political speeches, and the rush of daily life, and one below, filled with whispers, canned food, and soft, nervous laughter. People told each other that it was only preparation, not panic. Yet, deep down, they all knew they were preparing for something they prayed would never happen. The ground had become both a shield and a reminder of how fragile safety really was. Governments across the globe invested in enormous underground complexes, labyrinths of steel doors, filtered air, and fluorescent lights. Some were designed for leaders, others for soldiers or scientists. Deep beneath mountains, rooms were filled with maps, telephones, and emergency rations. Everything was labeled, organized, and planned, as if planning could protect humanity from itself. These shelters were monuments to human intelligence and human fear. Meanwhile, in quiet suburbs and rural towns, the same idea took a humbler form. Families stored food, water, and flashlights in corners of their homes. Children played near bunkers without understanding why they existed. To them, it was all a kind of adventure, a secret world where they could pretend to be explorers, unaware that the adults were pretending too, just to stay calm. The imagination of innocence softened the fear of the unknown. The deeper people dug, the more they seemed to realize that fear had no bottom. Each new shelter led to a new design, a new plan, a new possibility of catastrophe. It was as if humanity was trying to bury its own anxiety, layer by layer. And though the ground offered silence, that silence wasn't peace. It was a pause, a waiting space between hope and dread. If your eyes feel heavy, imagine the stillness underground, the faint hum of air filters, the echo of footsteps in metal corridors, the smell of damp concrete and machine oil. Down there, time moved differently. Clocks ticked slower, voices grew softer, and the outside world began to feel like a distant dream. The underground was not a place of comfort. It was a promise of endurance. Some people decorated their shelters with books, radios, and family photos. They called it home, even though they hoped never to live there. Others could not bear to visit their bunkers at all, afraid of admitting that they might one day need them. It was a strange contradiction, building protection against something you couldn't imagine surviving. In the end, the walls of concrete felt less like safety and more like confession. As decades passed, the designs grew more elaborate. Underground networks stretched across continents, complete with hospitals, meeting rooms, and sleeping quarters. They were built with precision, yet filled with uncertainty. Each one was a silent statement that the world above could not be trusted. Humanity had turned the earth into a mirror, reflecting both its intelligence and its fear. Above ground, life continued as usual. People went to work, attended school, and laughed under clear skies. But beneath that normalcy lay a constant hum, the knowledge that, somewhere, below the soil, a hidden world waited. The earth, once a symbol of life and growth, had become humanity's last line of defense. And in that quiet underground darkness, the Cold War's most haunting truth lived on. That peace, at its most fragile, often hides beneath the weight of fear. As the world continued to build downward, the fear above only grew quieter, not gone, just hidden. The bunkers became part of the landscape, invisible but always near. Politicians spoke of deterrence, scientists spoke of progress, and ordinary people spoke less about their fear. But everyone knew. The ground had become the final border between survival and the unimaginable. It was a strange comfort to think that safety might exist beneath the earth, waiting like a shadow that never moved. In those cold spaces, everything felt distant. The world outside was only a rumor carried through radio static. The air was filtered, the light artificial, and time lost its rhythm. The underground was timeless, a place where the body waited while the mind tried to stay human. Some found calm in the isolation. Others found it unbearable, haunted by the thought that the world above might already be gone. Down there, hope was measured in silence. The bunkers reflected something deeply human, the will to endure, even when endurance felt impossible. People stocked shelves, checked generators, and kept lists of supplies, as if lists could protect them from fear. Psychologists studied how long a person could live underground without sunlight, without a sense of day or night. The answer was always uncertain. The Cold War was not only testing nations, it was testing the limits of the human mind. Above ground, the paranoia shaped entire generations. Children grew up knowing the word nuclear before they understood its meaning. School drills continued, sirens echoed through neighborhoods, and adults pretended it was routine. But behind every calm face was the same unspoken question. If the sky ever burns, will the ground still save us? That uncertainty lingered in every household, like a quiet echo that never fully faded. If you listen to this part of history, you might feel a stillness settle in, the stillness of waiting. It's the kind of silence that feels heavy, not peaceful. The kind that makes you notice your own heartbeat. People learn to live with that rhythm, the pulse of anxiety beneath the surface of ordinary life. They didn't talk about it much, but it shaped everything. How they worked, how they loved, how they slept at night. In the late 1970s, some bunkers were repurposed into archives, museums, or storage. Others were simply sealed, forgotten by the world that built them. Grass grew over their entrances, hiding the scars in the landscape. Yet, beneath the soil, everything remained: the furniture, the air tanks, the silent proof of a time when the world believed it could hide from itself. Even in abandonment, the underground remembered. Some scientists and officials still visited those places, walking through dim corridors with flashlights. Dust covered everything, but the air still felt heavy, as if the walls themselves remembered fear. They described the sound of their footsteps, hollow, endless, echoing like memories refusing to fade. For a moment, it was as if time had stopped in those rooms, waiting for a signal that never came. If your eyes begin to close, let the imagery settle softly. The cold walls, the quiet hum of electricity, the sense of safety mixed with sadness. These bunkers were built to save life, but they also captured the world's loneliness. In the search for safety, humanity built itself a mirror, a reflection of both brilliance and fear. It's a reminder that sometimes, in trying to protect life, we forget to live it. When the Cold War began to thaw, many of these underground sanctuaries were abandoned for good. Nations began to talk, not through warnings, but through agreements. The threat of instant destruction didn't disappear, but it stepped back as if exhausted. And so, the world slowly returned to the surface, blinking in the light of its own survival. The doors of the bunkers closed quietly, leaving behind the echoes of what might have been. And tonight, as you listen, imagine the earth resting still and calm, the bunkers beneath it now silent. The people who once feared the sky now sleep under it again, their fear replaced by distant memory. The ground above them blooms with life, trees growing where concrete once waited. The Cold War's underground world has faded, but its story remains, a soft reminder that even in darkness, humanity has always searched for light. It was October 1962. The air felt colder than usual, though it wasn't the season. It was something heavier, something invisible. Across the globe, people carried on with their lives, unaware that the world was holding its breath. For 13 days, humanity stood closer to destruction than it ever had before. This was the Cuban Missile Crisis, a moment when one wrong word, one wrong move, could have ended everything. The story began quietly, as most do in the Cold War. A few photographs, taken by a high-flying American plane, revealed something alarming on the island of Cuba: long, shadowed shapes that weren't supposed to be there. Missiles. Soviet missiles. Weapons capable of reaching cities far beyond the sea. The news traveled fast through military channels, each report whispered with growing disbelief. The world had changed overnight. In Washington, leaders gathered in secret rooms filled with smoke and silence. Maps covered the tables, red lines stretched across oceans, and every decision felt like a coin flip between peace and disaster. Voices stayed low, careful. No one wanted to speak too fast. They all understood that history had narrowed to this moment, a single thread of restraint separating calm from chaos. Across the ocean, in Moscow, a similar silence filled the halls. Messages were coded, translated, and delayed, each side struggling to read the other's intentions. The leaders of both nations did not want war, not truly, but fear makes even the wise tremble. They stared at their advisors, wondering if the other side was thinking the same thing. The uncertainty was unbearable, and yet they had to appear composed. Meanwhile, in homes around the world, people felt the change in the air without knowing why. The news began to hint at tension. Radio broadcasters spoke more slowly. Teachers avoided questions in classrooms. There was a nervous rhythm in the way people moved, as if they were subconsciously listening for something, waiting for a sound that never came. Fear had seeped into the everyday. Ships began to move across the Atlantic, carrying not just supplies but expectations. The US declared a naval blockade, drawing a line around Cuba. Soviet vessels sailed toward it. In those hours, every radar screen, every signal, every heartbeat seemed amplified. The ocean became the stage for a standoff that no one could afford to win. One miscalculation, and the world would burn. If you imagine it now, Picture the stillness of that moment, the hum of engines, the steady voices of radio operators trying to sound calm. Beneath that calm lay panic held tightly in place. Soldiers checked equipment without speaking. Pilots waited for orders that might never come. The entire planet seemed to balance on a breath, unwilling to exhale. Inside command centers, clocks ticked louder than usual. Generals spoke in clipped tones, their faces pale under fluorescent light. Every decision felt final. Every word carried the weight of millions of lives. The people in those rooms weren't thinking about victory. They were thinking about survival. In that sense, the Cold War's greatest danger wasn't hatred. It was fear pretending to be logic. If you're still awake, let the sound of this story move slowly. Imagine the tension as something distant now, like thunder fading beyond the hills. The men and women of that time couldn't sleep, but you can. You can listen from safety, from years beyond the edge of that fear. Their sleepless nights became the reason yours can be peaceful. For 13 long days, the world waited. Letters were sent, read, and rewritten. Messages crossed oceans with deliberate caution. Each side tested the limits of patience, hoping the other would blink first. And through all of it, the fate of civilization hung on the simple idea that maybe, just maybe, reason would prevail over pride. As the crisis deepened, the world's leaders began to feel the weight of every minute. Communications between Washington and Moscow grew more frantic. Translators worked through the night, passing notes that might mean peace or might mean the end. Each side spoke in careful phrases, every word chosen like a step across thin ice. The entire planet seemed to listen, though no one could do anything but wait. The silence of that waiting was louder than any explosion. Military planes circled the skies. Soldiers stood ready but afraid. The ocean, filled with submarines and warships, felt smaller than ever. Each captain carried the power to start what no one could stop. And yet, most of them hesitated, their hands hovering over controls, praying that no order would come. The world had learned too well that bravery did not always mean action. Sometimes, it meant holding still. In one of those moments, a misunderstanding nearly broke the silence. A Soviet submarine, trapped beneath the waves and unable to communicate, believed war had begun. Its commander prepared to launch a nuclear torpedo. But one man, a quiet officer named Vasily Arkhipov, refused. He doubted the order. He waited. His calm defiance may have saved the world. History would later call it coincidence. Perhaps it was mercy instead. By the 10th day, both sides were exhausted. Letters grew softer in tone, filled less with threat and more with weariness. The men who had spent their lives building power now found themselves begging for time. The world's greatest nations were reduced to a single hope, that reason might still matter. And slowly, that hope began to work. Messages of compromise crossed the sea, cautious but sincere. If your mind drifts, let it rest in this fragile moment of balance. The storm has not passed yet, but the first signs of calm are appearing. Imagine the sky clearing, the tension in the air loosening like a held breath released. The leaders were not heroes, but human, tired, frightened, and desperate to avoid being remembered as the ones who ended everything. On the 12th day, an agreement began to form. The Soviet Union would remove its missiles from Cuba. The United States would quietly withdraw its own from Turkey. The trade was unspoken at first, hidden beneath diplomatic language, but it was enough. The line between survival and catastrophe began to fade, replaced by cautious relief. The world had been to the edge and turned away. When the crisis ended, there was no celebration. No victory parades, no speeches of triumph. Just silence, the kind that comes after thunder. People woke up the next morning and went to work, as if nothing had happened. Children walked to school, unaware that the night before, their future had been decided in secret rooms. The ordinary world resumed, fragile but intact. Those who had lived through it never forgot the feeling, the strange stillness of almost losing everything. It changed them. It changed how nations spoke, how they planned, how they measured power. It was no longer about who could win, but who could survive. The Cold War remained, but from that moment onward, its tone grew quieter, more cautious. The world had seen its reflection too clearly to ever feel invincible again. Years later, when historians revisited those 13 days, they found something unexpected. Not just fear, but restraint. Among the tension and mistakes, there were moments of mercy, small choices that shaped history's direction. A letter rewritten. A pause before pressing a button. A refusal to obey. Humanity had stood on the edge of its own destruction and chosen to step back. And now, as you listen, the world outside your window is calm. The sky is still. The story of the Cuban Missile Crisis reminds us how thin the line between chaos and peace can be, and how easily it's forgotten. But for now, let that lesson rest. The danger has passed. The world survived another night. So can you. Breathe softly. Close your eyes. Let history fade into quiet. When the missiles were removed and the tension eased, the world exhaled, quietly, cautiously, as if afraid to wake the fear that had just fallen asleep. The Cuban Missile Crisis had ended, but its shadow stretched far beyond those 13 days. People tried to go back to their ordinary routines, but nothing truly felt ordinary anymore. The memory of standing on the edge lingered in every thought, in every glance toward the sky. Humanity had stared into its own reflection and seen how close it had come to losing everything. From that moment on, life in the Cold War became a strange mix of normalcy and dread. The danger no longer screamed. It hummed softly beneath the surface of daily life. The early 1960s became an era of contradiction, laughter and music filling the air, while underground shelters quietly gathered dust. Televisions glowed with images of progress, men walking on the moon, new inventions promising a brighter future, leaders shaking hands for the cameras. And yet, behind every image of confidence was the quiet knowledge that it could all vanish in an instant. People began to live with two realities, one of peace and one of possibility. They planted gardens, built homes, and raised children under skies they never fully trusted. The Cold War had become less about conflict and more about coexistence with fear. For those who lived through it, anxiety became background noise, constant, low, familiar. It was in the news, in the way teachers spoke about safety drills, in the tone of radio announcers late at night. People learned to smile through unease, to celebrate while holding their breath. Governments promised protection, but protection meant preparation. And preparation meant remembering that peace was only temporary. The world had found a way to survive by pretending that danger was distant, a performance that everyone knew by heart, even when no one spoke about it. If you imagine it, picture a living room in 1965, a family gathered around a black and white television, the sound of a cheerful jingle playing between news bulletins. The father reads the newspaper, its headlines about world affairs that seem both far away and uncomfortably close. The mother knits quietly, her thoughts elsewhere. A child plays on the carpet, building towers out of wooden blocks, unaware that real towers of steel and fuel wait silently across oceans. Outside, the world feels calm. Inside, the silence carries weight. That was life in the shadow, safe on the surface, trembling underneath. Art, music, and film began to reflect this duality. Songs carried hidden meanings. Movies used fiction to speak truths that could not be said aloud. Behind every love story or adventure, there was an undercurrent of uncertainty, the sense that time itself might be running out. And yet, beauty persisted. Artists painted more brightly, writers dreamed more deeply, as if they could fight fear with creation. The Cold War may have frozen politics, but it sparked imagination in ways the world had never seen. If your thoughts start to drift, let them wander through this quieter part of history. The world was still afraid, but it had learned to breathe again. Fear became softer, more manageable, something that could be folded neatly into routine. In its own strange way, that calm was its own kind of courage. People didn't need to deny fear to keep living. They simply learned to carry it gently, like a shadow that followed them wherever they went. In every city, life continued as if by instinct. Markets opened, trains ran on time, laughter echoed from parks and schools. Yet in the background, invisible machines listened to the air, radar towers, signal interceptors, satellites orbiting the planet. Every conversation, every flight, every distant explosion was noted, analyzed, archived. The Cold War shadow wasn't only emotional, it was physical. An entire network of eyes and ears stretched across the world. People didn't see it, but they felt it, like static in the air. Even dreams changed. Psychologists of the era recorded that many people dreamt of falling skies, of endless horizons, of lights too bright to look at. It wasn't always fear, sometimes it was awe. Humanity had entered an age where it could destroy itself or reach the stars, and in that contradiction, people found both wonder and unease. Night after night, the subconscious replayed the balance between progress and peril. Sleep was no longer escape, it was reflection. By the late 1970s, a quiet fatigue had settled in. The Cold War no longer shocked anyone. It simply existed, like weather that refused to change. Generations were born into it, never knowing a world without tension. They grew up learning that safety was conditional, that peace required constant vigilance. Yet, they also learned resilience. The human spirit, after decades of living beside danger, had found a rhythm in endurance. People began to see beauty not in perfection, but in persistence, in the simple fact that life continued. And so, the world learned to live in the shadow, not denying it, not escaping it, but accepting it as part of existence. Cities glowed through the night, music played on the radio, children laughed in schoolyards. Above them all, the invisible balance of power continued its silent dance. The Cold War had not ended, but it had softened, settling into the rhythm of everyday life. And as the world learned to sleep beneath its shadow, it discovered something profound. That peace, even fragile peace, can survive in the most unlikely places, even under the constant hum of fear. As the decades turned, the Cold War's presence became so constant that it almost felt invisible. People no longer flinched at the sound of sirens during drills or the flash of breaking news. The extraordinary had become ordinary. The idea that life could end in minutes no longer sparked panic. It became background noise, a quiet hum that people learned to live beside. And somehow, in that uneasy stillness, humanity found a kind of peace. It was not the peace of comfort, but of endurance, the peace of those who keep walking even when they do not know where the road ends. In homes across the world, people built routines around uncertainty. They saved, planned, and hoped, even while half expecting disaster. They fell in love, started families, and made promises for futures they weren't sure would come. It was perhaps one of humanity's most remarkable acts of defiance, to continue dreaming in a world that could disappear at any time. The Cold War taught people to cherish the small, the daily, the quiet moments that made life feel normal. A shared meal, a slow walk home, the laughter of children. These things became symbols of quiet resistance against fear. If you imagine those nights, they were filled with soft light and restless thought. Radios whispered updates while the wind brushed against the window panes. People checked their clocks, their doors, their skies, and then tried to sleep. Some prayed for safety, others trusted in chance. But when morning came, life always resumed. Coffee brewed, factories opened, trains rolled forward. The world seemed determined to prove that it could continue. And perhaps that was the truest victory of all. In every corner of the world, stories of small courage unfolded unnoticed. A teacher comforting her students during a siren test. A mother refusing to let her children see her fear. A worker building machines of defense, then going home to read his son a bedtime story. These were the quiet heroes of the era, not soldiers or politicians, but ordinary people who chose calm over chaos, love over panic. They lived under a cloud of tension, yet somehow their hearts remained open. Governments, meanwhile, carried on with their game of balance. Treaties were signed, borders fortified, satellites launched. Each act of diplomacy came wrapped in suspicion, but also in weary relief. It was as if the world had agreed to keep its distance, close enough to communicate, far enough not to collide. The Cold War's strange equilibrium depended on restraint, on the shared understanding that no one could afford to lose control again. In that restraint, peace found its most unlikely home. If you let your thoughts drift, you might hear the echo of that restraint in the present, the quiet lessons of a world that learned fear too deeply to forget it. Those lessons still live in the way nations speak, in the way people look to the sky with wonder and caution. The Cold War changed humanity's imagination. It gave people both the dream of reaching space and the fear of falling from it. Progress and danger became two sides of the same thought. In art, that tension remained alive. Painters filled their canvases with fractured shapes and distant horizons. Filmmakers told stories of spies, isolation, and paranoia, but also of hope and reconciliation. Even love stories carried undertones of uncertainty. Lovers separated by borders, letters delayed by politics, time itself acting as the antagonist. The art of the Cold War era became a mirror of its people, fragile, honest, and quietly brave. By the late 1980s, fatigue had grown deep enough to touch even the most powerful. The endless vigilance, the constant calculations, the quiet dread, it all began to feel heavier than the weapons themselves. People had grown tired of suspicion. They began to whisper about change, about freedom, about unity. The walls that had once seemed eternal began to tremble under the weight of exhaustion and hope. Something, somewhere, was beginning to give. If you close your eyes, imagine that moment, a world still cold, yet softening. A world tired of silence, ready to speak again. The shadow of fear hadn't vanished, but it had thinned, letting light through the cracks. The laughter of children began to sound louder than the hum of missiles. The future, once a thing to fear, began to feel possible again. Humanity was learning that even the longest night must eventually turn toward dawn. And so, as the 1980s drew to a close, the Cold War began to fade, not with a bang, but with a sigh. The walls that divided began to crumble, and the silence that had ruled for decades began to lift. The shadow remained, as all great shadows do, but it was gentler now, more distant. The world had survived its own fear, and in that survival, it discovered something extraordinary, that hope, no matter how small, can outlast even the darkest of ages. When the Cold War entered its later decades, the world's fear took on a new shape, cold, calculated, and built from metal. Humanity had survived the brink of disaster, but the lesson it learned was not peace. It was efficiency. War no longer needed soldiers to march or cannons to roar. The new battlefield was silent, glowing with buttons, screens, and blinking lights. Machines began to replace instinct. Computers, radars, and satellites became the watchful eyes of nations that no longer trusted their own. The machines of destruction were born not from hatred, but from the need to stay alert, to never be surprised again. In underground bunkers and distant command centers, men sat before endless panels of switches and monitors. The hum of electricity replaced the sound of marching boots. Every signal, every flicker of light carried the possibility of the end. But the strangest part was how normal it all seemed. War had become a process, a calculation, something managed through data and probability. The human heart had been moved one step away from the trigger, replaced by circuits and coded instructions. Fear had been automated. The great powers began to invest not only in weapons, but in systems that could think, or at least, react, faster than any human could. These systems watched the skies, scanning for anomalies, for the faintest sign of incoming missiles. The logic was simple. Machines don't panic. Machines don't hesitate. But that same simplicity carried a quiet horror. Because machines also don't forgive mistakes. One wrong reading, one line of faulty code, and humanity could vanish before anyone had time to ask why. If you imagine the sound of that era, it isn't the roar of engines or explosions. It's the constant hum of machinery, the low vibration of computers calculating endlessly. The world's defense was built on soundless rhythm, on blinking lights in dark rooms where night and day didn't matter. Men worked in shifts, watching, recording, waiting for something they prayed would never happen. Outside, the sky seemed calm. Inside, it was a place of numbers, coordinates, and quiet dread. Missiles grew faster, sleeker, and smarter. The race for power had evolved into a race for precision. Entire networks were designed to detect and retaliate automatically, promising that no first strike would ever go unanswered. It was called mutual assured destruction, a phrase both logical and terrifying. The idea was simple. If both sides could destroy each other completely, neither would dare to begin. It was peace built on the certainty of extinction. In those years, a strange kind of faith developed, not in leaders, not in nations, but in machines. People trusted blinking lights more than human promises. They believed that calculation could prevent chaos, that systems could be perfect where emotions failed. Yet deep down, everyone knew machines only reflect their makers. Behind every algorithm was a heartbeat, behind every code a fear. The illusion of control was comforting, but fragile. If your thoughts begin to drift, let them follow the rhythm of those quiet machines, the steady pulse of something both alive and lifeless. Imagine the faint glow of screens, the cold metal panels, the soft clicking of keys. In that mechanical hum lived humanity's most dangerous hope, that intelligence, even artificial, could keep destruction at bay. But machines have no mercy, and they do not dream of peace. They only follow orders. Accidents happen more often than anyone admitted. False alarms, radar glitches, software errors. Each one a moment where the end nearly came by accident. Once, a computer mistook sunlight reflecting off clouds for incoming missiles. Another time, a training tape was mistakenly loaded into a live defense system. Sirens blared, generals prepared, and within minutes, someone had to decide whether to believe the machine or their own doubt. More than once, doubt saved the world. As the machines grew more powerful, they also became invisible. Satellites orbited above, unseen. Wires ran beneath oceans, connecting continents through silent messages. The Earth itself became part of the network, a web of listening posts, cameras, and sensors that never slept. Humanity had created an organism made of technology, a nervous system stretched across the planet. It was brilliant. It was terrifying. And it was always watching. The men who worked with these systems rarely spoke about what they saw. They spent their nights in dimly lit rooms, surrounded by the constant hum of energy, watching screens that defined the line between existence and erasure. They were the quiet guardians of the modern age, bound not by bravery, but by vigilance. Each button, each light, each command was a reminder. Peace depended on machines that could end peace instantly. It was the strangest paradox in history, survival through automation. As the decades passed, the line between human decision and machine judgment grew thinner. Generals and analysts began to rely more on the accuracy of data than on instinct. Strategy became a matter of mathematics, not morality. Computers predicted outcomes before leaders could finish their sentences. And in that precision, something subtle was lost, the space where doubt used to live. Doubt, though often seen as weakness, had once been the pause that saved humanity. Without it, even hesitation began to fade. The Cold War entered an age of quiet perfection, one where a single number could mean life or extinction. Yet despite their sophistication, the machines were not flawless. They were reflections of the people who built them, shaped by ambition, pride, and fear. A wire out of place, a misread signal, a software bug, these became the new forms of danger. In one haunting incident, a Soviet radar system detected what it thought was an American strike. 5 missiles, incoming and unstoppable. The officer in charge, Stanislav Petrov, looked at the screen, then at the sky. He felt something was wrong. He waited. And by waiting, he prevented a war that never needed to happen. It was another moment when a human heart, not a machine, saved the world. If you imagine that night, it was ordinary in every way. Fluorescent lights, humming machines, the soft crackle of radio transmissions. And yet, beneath that normalcy, the weight of existence rested on one quiet decision. Petrov's story was not heroic in the traditional sense. It was human. He trusted instinct over protocol, conscience over command. History, once again, turned on silence, a a single man choosing not to obey a blinking red light. The machines of destruction could measure everything except compassion. Meanwhile, outside those hidden rooms, the world kept moving forward. Cities sparkled with new technologies, new inventions, new dreams of the future. The same tools that threatened to end civilization also gave birth to its next chapter. Satellites mapped the Earth, computers revolutionized communication, and digital systems began to shrink the planet into a single web of connection. The irony was impossible to ignore. The engines of war were quietly building the tools of peace. Progress and peril had become indistinguishable. Governments learned to live with this contradiction. They called it balance, but it was more like surrender to the inevitability of dependence on machines. Every missile, every system, every alert depended on a chain of code so complex that even those who built it could no longer see its entirety. Control became an illusion, comforted only by the hope that everything would work as intended. But technology has no conscience, and perfection has no empathy. If your mind begins to wander, imagine the glow of computer lights reflecting on tired faces, men and women staring into data that never sleeps, the hum of electricity replacing conversation. These were the new watchtowers, made not of stone, but of steel and signal. The guardians of peace could no longer see the stars above them. The world's fate was buried under screens. Humanity had traded watchfulness for surveillance, judgment for precision, and prayer for programming. As artificial intelligence grew, so did the dream of removing human error entirely. Machines would one day make the hard choices, some said, faster, cleaner, safer. But deep down, there was a quiet fear that machines would not just think for humans, but think as them. The idea of responsibility began to blur. If a system decided to launch, who was to blame? The machine that executed, or the human who trusted it? The question had no answer. Perhaps that was the most frightening truth of all. By the 1980s, the technology had become both invisible and omnipresent. Every continent hummed with data. Every ocean carried the pulse of undersea cables. Satellites watched, computers analyzed, and nations slept uneasily beneath their mechanical guardians. The Cold War had created something larger than ideology. It had given birth to a new kind of consciousness, built not from thought, but from vigilance. Humanity had surrounded itself with mirrors that never blinked. In secret, some scientists began to question what they had made. They spoke softly of limits, of ethics, of the danger of handing over decisions that should belong to conscience. But their voices were faint compared to the momentum of progress. Once technology begins, it rarely stops. The world's defense became a runaway clock, a system too vast, too fast, too woven into daily life to dismantle. The machines no longer served the Cold War. They were the Cold War. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear that era, not in noise, but in vibration. The low hum of servers, the steady pulse of signals crossing continents. It was the heartbeat of an anxious civilization, one that trusted machines to protect it from itself. And yet, in that constant hum, there was something almost peaceful, a reminder that even fear, when automated, can become background noise. The machines of destruction still waited, silent and patient. But for now, they remained asleep, as if humanity itself had whispered, "Not yet." By the early 1980s, something subtle began to shift. The Cold War, once frozen in paranoia, was starting to soften. The air still felt tense, but the edges of fear were beginning to blur. After decades of silence, fatigue had replaced fury. People were tired of walls, of threats, of living beneath the shadow of a sky that could end them. Even the leaders, the men who had inherited the tension of their predecessors, began to realize that no machine, no speech, no weapon could hold fear forever. Humanity was not designed to live in constant winter. Slowly, cautiously, the thaw began. Across the world, words replaced warnings. Diplomats met in rooms that once held suspicion. Treaties were signed, promises exchanged, small steps that felt enormous after years of stillness. Each agreement was fragile, almost hesitant, as though both sides feared the warmth of peace might melt too quickly. But for the first time in a generation, the language of conversation began to return. The world had lived too long in whispers. Now it was learning to speak again. In homes and offices, people felt the difference before they fully understood it. News anchors spoke in calmer tones. The rhetoric of doom faded from headlines. The threat of annihilation, once constant, began to drift into the background of memory. Of course, the weapons were still there, sleeping quietly in silos and submarines, but the fear surrounding them started to lose its hold. A strange optimism crept into the world's rhythm, quiet and careful, but real. Leaders on both sides of the divide began to sense the exhaustion in their people. Decades of vigilance had drained entire nations. It was no longer about who was stronger or richer. It was about who could keep standing. The human cost of endless competition had become too visible to ignore. Children had grown into adults knowing only division. They wanted something different, not victory, but release. If you imagine that moment, picture the sound of old walls cracking, not from explosions, but from disuse. The propaganda grew quieter, the speeches more human. Even in music and art, a softness began to appear. Songs spoke of hope again, of unity, of simple life beyond ideology. The world wasn't suddenly kind, but it was tired of being cruel. The slow thaw was not a revolution, it was a sigh. Some credit the change to leadership, to those who dared to speak differently, who saw enemies as people rather than symbols. But in truth, the thaw came from below, from the quiet hearts of millions who simply wanted to live. The people had changed faster than their governments. They no longer believed that destruction was destiny. Their patience, their exhaustion, became the quiet fuel of peace. In cities divided by politics, like Berlin, whispers of hope began to echo through narrow streets. Young people gathered to talk, to dream, to imagine a world where travel didn't require permission. Across borders, musicians collaborated, letters crossed checkpoints, and ideas slipped through the cracks of censorship. The human desire for connection, long suppressed, began to find new roots. Hope traveled quietly, but persistently. The thaw was not without its challenges. Distrust still ran deep. Every handshake carried the weight of decades of deceit. But the tone was changing. Leaders spoke not of domination, but of coexistence. Meetings once guarded by soldiers now opened to the press. Where once there were threats, now there were smiles, cautious, diplomatic smiles, but genuine enough to be noticed. The world had begun to look at itself with something new, humility. If you listen closely to that time in history, it doesn't sound like triumph. It sounds like a deep breath. The speeches were slower, the applause softer. There was no celebration, no grand moment of realization. Just the gradual fading of fear, like snow melting on rooftops at the first touch of spring. Humanity had not yet reached peace, but it was learning to imagine it again. And in that imagining, something beautiful began to bloom. For the first time in decades, children were born into a world that seemed less divided. The maps still showed borders, but minds began to open. The Cold War had taught humanity the cost of mistrust, and now it was teaching the value of patience. The thaw was fragile, imperfect, and uncertain, but it was real. It was the sound of the world remembering how to hope. As the years went on, the thaw deepened. Nations that had once refused to speak now began to cooperate, not from trust, but from necessity. Trade agreements replaced weapon stockpiles, and cultural exchanges replaced propaganda. Students studied abroad, scientists collaborated across oceans, and writers translated one another's words. The barriers of language and ideology began to soften. Humanity, after decades of suspicion, was remembering its shared curiosity. The Cold War had made the world smaller through fear. Now it was becoming smaller through understanding. Inside government halls, the tone of conversation changed. Where generals once argued over missile placement, now they debated budgets, education, and art. The idea of peace began to feel practical, even ordinary. It wasn't a dream anymore. It was policy. Leaders who had once been raised to prepare for war were now being taught to prevent it. And while the weapons still waited in their silos, the hands that had built them were slowly being repurposed toward technology, medicine, and space. The same tools of competition had found gentler uses. For ordinary people, the change felt quieter, almost unnoticed. Life simply began to lighten. The fear that once filled every broadcast began to fade into history documentaries and school lessons. Children no longer practiced hiding under desks. They learned about stars instead of missiles, about planets instead of politics. The constant dread that had once shadowed daily life began to dissolve into relief, the kind of peace that feels strange at first, because no one remembers how it's supposed to feel. If you imagine it, picture a morning in the late 1980s, soft sunlight falling on city streets, the sound of traffic blending with laughter. The radio hums with music instead of warnings. The sky is just the sky again, no longer a place of threat. For the first time in decades, people begin to look up without fear. The warmth of ordinary life, something forgotten for so long, returns like an old melody rediscovered. Peace, once unthinkable, feels almost natural. The leaders who helped bring this change were not perfect. They made mistakes, misjudged, and faltered. But what mattered most was that they talked. They sat across tables once reserved for enemies and admitted their exhaustion. They realized that no ideology was worth extinction. In their hesitation, in their human weariness, the thaw found its strength. Sometimes peace begins not with hope, but with fatigue, the simple desire to stop fighting. The late years of the Cold War were filled with strange beauty. Cities that had once been symbols of division began to glow with light and music. Travelers crossed borders that had been closed for generations. People who had spent their lives on opposite sides of walls finally met face to face. The world did not suddenly become kind, but it became possible again. Every small act of friendship felt like rebellion against decades of fear. If your mind begins to drift, let it rest in this fragile calm. Imagine the air of that time, cool, open, and filled with the scent of new beginnings. The tension was still there, faintly, like distant thunder. But it no longer ruled the rhythm of life. The Cold War was melting slowly, not into triumph, but into tenderness. The silence that once meant danger now meant rest. Humanity was learning, at last, how to breathe together. In the final years, as the walls fell and the barriers dissolved, the world did not celebrate as conquerors. It simply exhaled, the long, weary breath of survival. The Cold War did not end with applause. It ended with relief. After decades of staring across the abyss, people realized they had survived not because of power, but because of restraint. The lesson was quiet but profound. Sometimes, the greatest strength lies in the decision not to destroy. And though the Cold War would leave its scars, in politics, in memory, in the hearts of those who lived it, it also left behind a truth worth keeping. That fear cannot last forever. That even the coldest winters eventually melt, and that humanity, flawed and frightened, is still capable of choosing life over despair. The thaw was not just political, it was human, a rediscovery of compassion after years of distance. So as the world stepped into the 1990s, the silence that once belonged to missiles and sirens was replaced by the sound of wind, of laughter, of ordinary life. It wasn't a perfect peace, but it was enough. The frost that had covered half a century was gone. What remained was the gentle warmth of survival, and the quiet understanding that even after the darkest ages, the human heart will always find its way toward light. When the Cold War finally began to fade, it didn't end with a roar. There were no fireworks, no grand declarations, no moment that clearly marked victory or defeat. It ended quietly, like the last ember of a long-burning fire cooling in the dark. For those who lived through it, the silence was both beautiful and strange. They had spent their lives waiting for disaster, and when it didn't come, they found themselves surrounded by an unfamiliar calm. The world had survived the unthinkable, but it no longer felt the same. The Cold War had ended, but its shadow still stretched across everything it had touched. Cities that once prepared for war began to rebuild in peace. The bunkers, command centers, and missile silos were sealed or forgotten, buried beneath fields and forests. Children played above them, unaware of the history sleeping below. What had once been symbols of fear became relics of human persistence, reminders that even in our darkest imagination, we still tried to survive. The earth slowly healed, and yet, deep within its soil, the echoes of that long anxiety remained. In museums, rusted machines and yellowed documents began to tell their stories. Maps once marked with red and blue pins were now artifacts of tension, studded with curiosity instead of terror. People walked past glass displays, looking at devices that once held the power to erase them. The Cold War had become history, distant enough to be safe, close enough to still feel real. It was a strange comfort to know that fear could be contained within a museum case. But what the Cold War truly left behind was not just machinery or treaties. It was memory, a collective understanding of fragility. For the first time in history, humanity had seen how close it could come to ending itself. That awareness became a quiet companion to every generation that followed. It whispered in classrooms, in films, in the design of policies and the tone of diplomacy. The world had learned, painfully, that power without restraint was not progress, it was peril. If you close your eyes, imagine standing in the late 1990s, looking at the world after the storm. The walls have fallen. The maps have changed. The sky feels open again. But beneath the surface, the habits of caution still linger. The old alliances still move quietly. The old fears still flicker faintly. The Cold War had frozen humanity for decades, and thawing takes time. Even peace, after so much tension, can feel fragile, like glass catching the morning light. People began to ask new questions. What had all those years been for? What had been gained by living so long in fear? Some said the Cold War gave us progress, satellites, science, technology. Others said it took too much, trust, innocence, and the simple comfort of believing in safety. Perhaps both were true. The legacy of that era was a paradox, a world more connected than ever, and yet more cautious, more watchful, more aware of its own limits. The nations that once stared each other down across oceans now began to cooperate in ways that would have seemed impossible before. Space exploration became a shared effort. Global summits replaced military standoffs. Scientists who once worked in secret laboratories now collaborated openly, searching for cures, clean energy, and understanding. Humanity, having once built weapons to destroy itself, began using that same ingenuity to protect itself instead. It was redemption, quiet and incomplete, but real. And yet, not all scars fade. In the lands where borders once divided families, traces of the old world still remain. Abandoned checkpoints, concrete walls cracked by time, memorials built for those who never made it across. These places became quiet teachers of humility. They remind those who visit that peace is not permanent, that safety is never guaranteed. But they also remind us that survival, once achieved, can be deeply beautiful. If your mind begins to wander, let it drift through that gentler world, a world still healing, still learning how to trust. The Cold War left behind more than fear. It left perspective. The realization that life, even under threat, continues. That laughter can exist beside danger. That progress, no matter how fragile, always finds its way through silence. The people who lived through it grew older, carrying their memories like invisible maps. They remembered drills, speeches, and sirens, but also kindness, small moments of connection that defied the division. And when they told their stories, they didn't speak of enemies. They spoke of endurance, of humanity's stubborn refusal to let fear have the final word. The world that emerged after the Cold War was quieter, but not without memory. The generation that had grown up beneath sirens began to build something gentler: art, architecture, science, and stories that spoke not of power, but of connection. They wanted their children to inherit something different, a world where fear was studied, not lived. Museums and books began to replace bunkers and missiles. Humanity was learning how to document its mistakes, not repeat them. The great experiment of survival had succeeded, but it had left behind a question that would echo for centuries. What will we do with this peace? In many ways, the Cold War reshaped how people understood danger and trust. It taught the world that wars could be fought without bullets, through information, silence, and perception. But it also proved that peace could exist without perfection. No nation left the era pure, but all left changed. The lessons written in those years were not about conquest, but about limits. That power cannot exist without patience, and that control is only valuable when tempered by mercy. If you imagine the world now, decades later, you can still see its fingerprints. Every satellite in the sky, every digital network connecting lives across oceans, carries the shadow of that age. The same technologies that once divided us now link us together. The Cold War, in its paradox, taught humanity how to build a weapon that could destroy the world, and in the process, how to build systems that could unite it. From danger came discovery. From fear came connection. For those who lived through the long silence, peace did not come all at once. It arrived slowly, like dawn creeping over frost-covered ground. Some carried their anxiety for the rest of their lives, flinching at sirens, distrusting good news, half expecting it all to return. But for their children, the air felt lighter. They played without glancing at the sky. They dreamed without counting the days. The thaw had turned into renewal, and the renewal into ordinary life. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it, the quiet rhythm of the modern world, still beating with the lessons of the Cold War. Not fear, but awareness. Not suspicion, but reflection. The age of missiles had given way to an age of mirrors, where humanity began to see itself more clearly. It was no longer about who might destroy the world, but who might care enough to protect it. That realization was the true end of the Cold War, not treaties or politics, but understanding. As the years passed, monuments rose where walls once stood. People came not to mourn, but to remember. They touched the cold stone, read the names, and felt gratitude that they had lived through history's most dangerous century. The memories were heavy, but they carried them with dignity. Because survival, once achieved, becomes a kind of wisdom, a reminder that the world can endure even its own mistakes. Scholars and storytellers continued to write about those years, but their tone changed. The fear that once filled their words softened into reflection. The Cold War was no longer a warning. It was a lesson. A long, complicated chapter in humanity's book, full of errors, but also of restraint. And like all great stories, it did not end in victory or defeat, but in balance. The balance between what could have been lost and what was miraculously kept. If your eyes are heavy, let them rest now. Imagine the world exhaling, the sound of air returning to lungs that had held their breath for half a century. The silence that followed the Cold War was not empty. It was peaceful. It was earned. The hum of fear had faded, replaced by the sound of life continuing, slowly, imperfectly, but beautifully. The story of the Cold War is not one of weapons, or politics, or power. It's the story of restraint, of people who, despite every reason to destroy, chose not to. It's the story of fear turning into understanding, and distance turning into dialogue. And though its shadows still linger, they serve as reminders of what we survived. The past does not sleep easily, but it rests better knowing it was endured. And now, as the night deepens, let the echoes of this history fade softly from your mind. The clocks of that era have stopped ticking, the sirens are silent, and the world, once so divided, lies still under one sky. Thank you for listening to this story tonight. May it bring you calm, reflection, and rest. May your dreams be light and your heart steady. The past is quiet now. The fire has gone out. Sleep peacefully,